Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Seaside UCC's weekly devotional. Today is Tuesday, June 30th, and it's hard to believe that tomorrow is the first day of July. We continue to be in the midst of a global pandemic that I just saw a post that said that daily cases could actually jump to as high as 100,000, which is hard to believe. But from my fellow Holy Cross alum, Dr. Anthony Fauci, apparently just said that in the hearing that's going on right now. So let's just take a moment before we start today's devotional to reflect on this pandemic and the movement, the racial reckoning movement that's been sweeping our country and the world the past month, and where this leads us heading into what in the U.S. is known as Independence Day holiday, but which was so poignantly and powerfully stated by Frederick Douglass all those years ago, not a holiday that for many people resonates in the same way as others, particularly for our Native and Black and Brown brothers and sisters who have not seen the promise of independence and the promise of equal justice under the law fully implemented in relationship to their lives. So let's take a moment together in silent prayer just to center ourselves and prepare ourselves for this moment together. Thank you. Today I'm going to share with you some words from a reflection that an old friend of mine, Dr. Mark Falbo, shared at the beginning of our experience with the pandemic. He was, recently retired, living in Maine with his spouse, and was thinking about where this leads us in this time, at that time of Easter, and now I think even as we head into the fifth Sunday after Pentecost, it's an important time to reflect on the pandemic and what it means for those of us as people of faith, and particularly those of us who follow Jesus. When Jesus passed, as we know, for them it was a moment of great worry, and even upon his return, he was unrecognizable until them, literally in the case of Thomas, until they actually in a very physical kind of way, felt their presence with them. But their lives had been radically disrupted during the 3 years of his ministry. They had turned away from careers. In many cases, though I think this is overstated in some of our theology, their families. And I think the real message was that the priority was on this new ministry and this new way of being a Christian community that Jesus inaugurated and that John had foretold. In Mark, in reflecting on Easter, and I would again add Pentecost and the disruption that the COVID-19 pandemic has created for all of us, said this in his notes that he shared with me some time ago. We all experience major disruptions in our personal lives. The loss of a parent or a spouse. Many of us have lost loved ones during this time of pandemic. The breakup with a loved one, divorce, the loss of health, or the sudden ending of a career, which has been the case for over 1 million people again, just in the most recent unemployment numbers. The loss of a job, in those cases, of home or business. And how many businesses are struggling right now, I know here on the island where I live, with the real uptick in cases, the impact that will continue to have on the state of Maine as far as who comes this summer and the amount of commitments people make to bed and breakfasts and to hotels and restaurants and the like, but also in my home state of Ohio where the cases are just going through the roof. Many of these disruptions are of a more personal kind. After a loved one dies, it's difficult to imagine what life would be without them. These special places are stark reminders that our existence has been irreversibly altered. Those special events and times rekindle tears of loss and reopen the heartbreak of mourning. You know, the mourning that never goes away, that we feel over the loss of a parent, God forbid, over the loss of a child or a loved one, a brother or sister, that comes back to haunt us in the most unexpected times, but also to, I think, the beautiful phrase about you'll know that you've sort of gotten over the loss when the first thought of a person brings a twinkle to your eye rather than a tear to your cheek. Many of us are fortunate enough to have caring family, friends, and neighbors who carry us through this empty space, our own personal Holy Saturdays. For many of us, Pentecost is like that, left longing, looking for the Holy Spirit, looking for wisdom. I'm adding this to Mark's words. And certainly in this time of pandemic, wondering what comes next. And in this time of racial reckoning, particularly for white folks, challenging ourselves to see the world in different and new ways. But over time, as you recall those special times, all those special places and days become less painful reminders of loss and become wondrous moments of joy. I know that's the case for me when I think of loved ones lost. Yes, there's the mourning, but there's also the sense of what a difference they made and what a role they played in helping to make me who I am, and I'm sure that's the case for you as well. Richard Rohr, who I actually quoted from extensively last week, Mark also quotes from, in saying that when you have left the tried and true, but you have not been able to replace it with anything else, it is when you are between your old comfort zone and any possible new answer. If you are not trained in how to hold anxiety, how to live with ambiguity, how to entrust and wait, you will run. Anything to flee this terrible cloud of unknowing. Let me quote from Richard again, because I think it's really important to hear these words and how we're right now in what spiritual directors would call a liminal. It's Liminal space, coming from the Latin liminus, meaning at a threshold. And we've heard a lot of talk about being at a tipping point in the past, Malcolm Gladwell's book in particular. But clearly, I think most of us feel now we're certainly at a threshold or a tipping point in our nation's history, if not as well in our personal lives, given what we've gone through in the pandemic. So let's rehear those words again. When you have left the tried and true, but have not yet been able to replace it with anything else, it is when you are between your old comfort zone and any possible new answer. If you are not trained in how to hold anxiety, how to live with ambiguity, how to entrust and wait, you will run. And you will run to anything to flee this terrible cloud of unknowing. It feels to me, I was out and about quite a bit yesterday, that many people are running, literally and figuratively, in complete denial about the scope and breadth of this pandemic, wanting to get back to normal, dropping the necessary precautions. And just because I don't have my face mask on doesn't mean I don't have it with me. You can see the new one I've been wearing lately from the UCC. Beautiful new Facebook we're giving to all of our members here. But we run from not only the ambiguity, but our fear about what comes next. And we know how much fear can hold on to us and keep us trapped in places that don't allow for the kind of personal growth we all need. But we need to trust, and we need to wait, and we need to live with and into that ambiguity. We have come, Mark ends his devotion, we have come from a long line of peoples who have lived through and thrived in disruptions. I mentioned Frederick Douglass earlier and his letter to America on the 4th of July. Just think for a moment about what that man in his own life went through. And if you haven't read his works or the recent biography of him, I'd really direct you to do so. Quite an inspiration. We've lived through the disruptions, as a dear friend shared, of what's happened to our native peoples. A friend of mine who recently spoke with me about the fear on Indian Island, as it's known here in Maine, that if the disease were to get to the island, it could wipe out the entire Penobscot community. We lived through the disruption of the Civil War, which many seem to still be fighting. We lived through the disruption of the Nazi genocide. We lived through the disruption of our intervention in Vietnam, the civil rights movement, the murder of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and so many others. We've lived through the disruption of apartheid, the wars in Central America, situations and events that had such an impact on my own faith, personal and professional development. Many of us have lived through death and divorce and longing and abandonment and betrayal. But the people that have gone before us, those that have loved us, both in real time and loved us in simply giving birth to those who came before us and imagining what their family might become, lived through and found a way to thrive even in times of disruption. The last few weeks we've been reading from Genesis, the story of Abraham, and Sarah, and Hagar, and Ishmael, and Isaac. And we know, like the story of those Abrahamic relatives, our family story includes a God that cares and a God who makes covenant with us and promises abundance, not in the material sense, but in the abundance of life that comes from faithfulness and the ability to thrive and become our best selves. Our family story, as Mark says, as a people of faith, includes stories of suffering and liberation from slavery in Egypt. Our story includes flawed men and women and the loss of what had become familiar, the destruction of the temple and the disbursement to foreign lands. The Psalms, our prayers, include both psalms of praise and thanksgiving, as well as psalms of lament. During the exile and eventual restitution, the prophets remind us that God is doing a new thing. And God is doing that in each of us, even this day. From Isaiah chapter 43, verse 19. Remember the events of the past. The things of long ago consider not. See, I am doing something new. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I am doing something new. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? We live in a time of confusion, of struggle, of disorientation and reorientation, of reckoning and the search for justice. We live at a time in which we are fully equipped as people of faith to understand is not too different from the times in which our ancestors have gone before us and what they have gone through. In our own family, be it an immigrant story, be it a story of enslavement, be it a story of genocide. Those of us who are still here on this land of the Wabanaki people, have an opportunity yet again to speak truth to power, to remember the events of the past, to be honest about what they meant for our ancestors and for this nation, and to join our hands working together for the kind of justice that is promised at Easter and that we're living into throughout this Pentecost season. Let us draw our strength from those stories of pain, of sorrow, of lament, and of injustice. And let us recall the strength and the wisdom of all those who have gone before us, so that together we might find a better, a wholer, a more loving, and a more kind way to be brother and sister to one another. Thank you for taking the time to join us this Tuesday, June 30th. I'll look forward to seeing you in the coming days, in person, at a distance, or online. And for those who are taking some time off this weekend, I hope you provide yourself an opportunity for the respite and the reflection, and frankly, just the simple rest from all that has transpired over the last few months, so that we can continue to build the kind of society together that we'd like to see, where each of us will be judged by the content of our character, and no person will feel that they are somehow left behind. Thank you, and may the peace that passes all understanding be with you throughout this day and the coming week. Take care.